Hello, and welcome back to Read Aloud with Dan. That's me, I'm Dan. Today we're reading from Friedrich Engels' Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. In previous versions of the writing, it was originally titled Socialism, Utopian, or rather Utopian Socialism and Scientific Socialism. When it was written and published originally in French. I think previously I told you the wrong year. The year it was published was 1880. Today we're reading from Chapter 2. Chapter 2, Dialectics. So, we're at this point where Chapter 1, Engels had gone through what the chapter is titled, The Development of Utopian Socialism. The development of the class that was the Bürger class, and thus the development of certain forms of consciousness based on the material conditions. Those forms of consciousness were a socialism in embryo. It was a socialism. It just wasn't developed and hashed out like the socialism of today. That was Chapter 1. Chapter 2 is about dialectics. We've already talking about Hegel a lot. And that's not Hegel, I'm sorry. That was Descartes, I'm sorry, why we had the wrong guy on the screen. We're going to be talking about Hegel a lot. This is Hegel, as you know. Let's get into it. Chapter 2, Dialectics. Engels says, in the meantime, along with and after the French philosophy of the 18th century, had arisen the new German ideology, culminating in Hegel, this handsome guy. Its greatest merit was the taking up again of dialectics as the highest form of reasoning. So, thank you, new German philosophers, I guess. Engels says the old Greek philosophers were all born natural dialecticians, and Aristotle, the most encyclopedic of them, had already analyzed the most essential forms of dialectic thought. The newer philosophy, on the other hand, although in it also dialectics had brilliant exponents, that is, Descartes and Spinoza, the newer philosophy had, especially through English influence, become more and more rigidly fixed in the so-called metaphysical mode of reasoning, by which also the French of the 18th century were almost wholly dominated, at all events in their special philosophical work. Outside philosophy, in the restricted sense, the French nevertheless produced masterpieces of dialectic. We need only call to mind Diderot's Les Niveaux de Rameau and Rousseau's Discours sur l'origine et les fondements, les linéages. I can't even do this. I tried my best. Engels says, we give here in brief the essential character of these two modes of thought. When we consider and reflect upon nature at large, or the history of mankind, or our own intellectual activity, at first we see the picture of an endless entanglement of relations and reactions, permutations and combinations, in which nothing remains what where and as it was, but everything moves, changes, comes into being, and passes away. We see, therefore, at first the picture as a whole, with its individual parts still more or less kept in the background. We observe the movements, transitions, connections, rather than the things that move, combine, and are connected. This primitive, naive, but intrinsically correct conception of the world is that of ancient Greek philosophy, and was first clearly formulated by Heraclitus. Everything is and is not, for everything is fluid, is constantly changing, constantly coming into being, and passing away. Hey, Dan, what does Heraclitus look like? Well, I thank you for asking. I just pulled up a photo of a statue, a bust. And we come here to Engels' seventh annotation. No, or rather the seventh annotation given. I'm not sure who gave the annotation. However, it says, unknown to the Western world until the 20th century. The Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu was a predecessor of, or possibly contemporary to, Heraclitus. Lao Tzu wrote the renowned Tao Te Ching, in which he also espouses the fundamental principles of dialectics. So this is an annotation that's correcting Engels here. He's got a little Eurocentric, isn't he? Engels says. But this conception, correctly as it expresses the general character of the picture of appearances as a whole, does not suffice to explain the details of which this picture is made up. And so long as we do not understand these, we have not a clear idea of the whole picture. In order to understand these details, we must detach them from their natural, special causes, effects, etc. This is primarily the task of natural sciences and historical research, branches of science which the Greek of classical times, on very good grounds, relegated to a subordinate position, because they had first of all to collect materials for these sciences to work upon. A certain amount of natural and historical material must be collected before there can be any critical analysis, comparison, and arrangement in classes, orders, and species. The foundations of the exact natural sciences were therefore first worked out by the Greeks and of the Alexandrian period, and later on in the Middle Ages by the Arabs. And here we come upon the eighth annotation, which reads, and it is sort of correcting Engels again, so that's the Alexandrian period of the development of science comprises the period extending from the 3rd century BC, or BCE, to the 7th century Common Era. The 17th century. So, 3rd century BCE to the 17th century CE. It derives its name from the town of Alexandria in Egypt, which was one of the most important centers of international economic intercourses at that time. In the Alexandrian period, mathematics, Euclid and Archimedes, geometry, astronomy, anatomy, physiology, etc., these attained considerable development. And China also began development in natural sciences in the 3rd century BC. But Engels is giving credit to whom? The Greeks. Reading on, Engels says, real natural science dates from the second half of the 15th century, and then onward it had advanced with constant increasing rapidity. The analysis of nature into its individual parts the grouping of the different natural processes and objects in definite classes, the study of the internal anatomy of organized bodies in their manifold forms, these were the fundamental conditions of the gigantic strides in our knowledge of nature that have been made during the last 400 years. But this method of work has also left us as legacy the habit of observing natural objects and processes in isolation, apart from their connection with the vast whole, of observing them in repose, not in motion, as constraints, not as essentially variables, in their death, not in their life. And when this way of looking at things was transferred by Bacon and Locke from natural science to philosophy, it brought forth the natural metaphysical mode of thought peculiar to the last century. Metaphysics, of course, is held in direct opposition to dialectics. These are two different modes of thought. Generally, one is either, a materialist or an idealist. From there, in those threads of thought, there's different threads of thought as well. There's dialectical thought, and then there's its opposite, metaphysical thought. Now he's going to talk about the metaphysician. And this is classic stuff right here. To the metaphysician, things and their mental reflexes, ideas, are isolated, are to be given one after the other and apart from each other, are objects of investigation, fixed, rigid, given once for all. He thinks in absolutely irreconcilable antitheses. His communication is yea, yea, nay, nay. For whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil. For him, a thing either exists or does not exist. A thing cannot at the same time be itself and something else. Positive and negative absolutely exclude one another. Cause and effect stand in a rigid antithesis to the other, one to the other, he says. At first, this mode of thinking seems to us very luminous, because it is of so-called sound common sense. And that's why it's so difficult to defeat sometimes, isn't it? Only sound common sense, respectable fellow that he is, in the homely realm of his own four walls, has very wonderful adventures directly. He ventures out into the world, into the wide world of research. And the metaphysical mode of thought, justifiable and necessary as it is in a number of domains whose extent varies according to the nature of the particular object of investigation, sooner or later reaches a limit beyond which it becomes one-sided, restricted, abstract, lost in insoluble contradictions. And a reading of some of Mao's philosophy will help you to understand what that means, what one-sided analysis means. I do suggest you go back and read On Contradiction if you haven't already, and then you will have a full understanding of what one-sided analysis means and what Engels is touching on here. That's what one-sided thinking is. It's metaphysical thinking, looking at only one side of the problem and not understanding it in its connection with the rest of the whole. Because, again, they see it as individuals, not as in connection with the universe. right? Like, yeah, you are a particular aspect of the universe, but like you are the universe. Universing. You're the Big Bang banging. Reading on. He talks about metaphysical analysis being one sided, restricted, abstract, lost in insoluble contradictions. In the contemplation of individual things, it forgets the connection between them. In the contemplation of their existence, it forgets the beginning and end of that existence. Of their repose, it forgets their motion. It, metaphysical analysis, cannot see the woods for the trees. For everyday purposes, we know and can say, that is, whether an animal is alive or not. But upon closer inquiry, we find that this is, in many cases, a very complex question, as the jurists know very well. They have cudgeled their brains in vain to discover a rational limit beyond which the killing of the child in its mother's womb is murder. Anyways, it is just as impossible to determine absolutely the moment of death. For what is this? Psychology proves that death is not an instantaneous, momentary phenomenon, but a very protracted process. Engels says, in like manner, every organized being is every moment the same and not the same. Every moment it assimilates matter supplied from without and gets rid of other matter. Every moment some cells of its body die and others build themselves anew. In a longer or shorter time, the matter of its body is completely renewed and is replaced by other molecules of matter, so that every organized being is always itself and yet something other than itself. Further, we find upon closer investigation that the two poles of an antithesis, positive and negative, that is, are as inseparable as they are opposed, and that despite all their opposition, they mutually interpenetrate. And we find, in like manner, that cause and effect are conceptions which only hold good in their application to individual cases. But as soon as we consider the individual cases in their general connection with the universe as a whole, they run into each other. And they become confounded when we contemplate that universal action and reaction in which causes and effects are externally changing places, so that what is effect here and now will be cause there and then, and vice versa. None of these processes and modes of thought enters into the framework of metaphysical reasoning. Dialectics, on the other hand, comprehends things and their representations, ideas, in their essential connection, concatenation, motion, origin, and ending. Such processes, as those mentioned above, are therefore so many corroborations of its own method of procedure. Nature is the proof of dialectics. And it must be said for modern science that it has furnished this proof with very rich materials increasingly daily, and thus has shown that, in the last resort, nature works dialectically and not metaphysically, that she does not move in the eternal oneness of a perpetually recurring circle, but goes through a real historical evolution. In this connection, Darwin must be named before all others. He dealt the metaphysical conception of nature the heaviest blow by his proof that all organic beings, plants, animals, and man himself, are the products of a process of evolution going on through millions of years. But the naturalists who have learned to think dialectically are few and far between. And this conflict of the results of discovery with preconceived modes of thinking explains the endless confusion now reigning in theoretical natural science, the despair of teachers as well as learners, of authors and readers alike. An exact representation of the universe, of its evolution, of the development of mankind, and of the reflection of this evolution in the minds of men, can therefore only be obtained by the methods of dialectics with its constant regard to the innumerable actions and reactions of life and death, of progressive and retrogressive changes. Now, it's easy, if I can go back here, for us to, understand how evolution works, but you have to understand that this represented a huge blow to the way people thought for centuries and centuries about the world. And this is very controversial stuff. And it's easy now, 200 years or so, I don't know, after Darwin, to go, okay, well, the world, the universe, everything's evolving out of itself. It's evolving out of itself. It's not being. It doesn't necessarily have to be controlled by some sort of outside, force, like a god. They're going, okay, hold on. It's just nature, and nature's doing itself, and it makes sense, right? And it's easy for us to make sense of that. But what Marx and Engels did was took that and just applied it to human society. They go, wait, hold. They go, wait. Humans are part of nature. We're not gods. We're not separate from it. So we're developing too, and it seems like human society and human thought itself is also developing and evolving out of itself. It can't evolve out of something else that doesn't exist. It has to evolve out of itself. Huh. And they applied it to human society, and they applied effectively this worldview to the development of human society and of human thought itself, and people still have not taken onto it in the same way that they have taken to evolution. Doesn't that blow your mind? I guess it's easier to see, I got that little graphic with the little monkey guy, or rather, descendants of monkeys, or rather, ancestors, monkeys' ancestors. What I'm saying is I'm not going to go through the whole thing of evolution. You guys get it. Point is, I think maybe we just need better graphics. Amira, you're on that? Okay. Let's keep reading. So again, he's saying, hey, if you want to understand reality, it's dialectics. You got to use dialectics. So he says here, and in this spirit, the new German philosophy has worked. Kant began his career by resolving the stable solar system of Newton and its eternal duration. After the famous initial impulse had once been given into the result of a historical process, the formation of the sun and all the planets out of a rotating nebulous mass. He refers to the Big Bang here as the famous first initial impulse. From this, he at the same time drew the conclusion that, given this origin of the solar system, its future death followed by necessity. His theory, half a century later, was established mathematically by Laplace, and half a century after that, the spectroscope proved the existence in space of such incandescent masses of gas in various stages of condensation. I think that theory is still holding. It's just that, what form will the visible universe's death take? We don't know. I've heard theories of a big crunch. I've heard theories of a big rip. And I don't know. So, reading on, Engels says, this new German philosophy culminated in the Hegelian system. In this system, and herein is its greatest merit, for the first time the whole world, natural, historical, intellectual, is represented as a process, that is, as in constant motion, change, transformation, development. And the attempt is made to trace out the internal connection that makes a continuous whole of all this movement and development. From this point of view, the history of mankind no longer appeared as a wild whirl of senseless deeds of violence, all equally condemnable at the judgment seat of mature philosophic reason, and which are best forgotten as quickly as possible, but as the process of evolution of man himself. It was now the task of the intellect to follow the gradual march of this process through all its devious ways, and to trace out the inner law running through all its apparently accidental phenomena. That the Hegelian system did not solve the problem it propounded is here immaterial. Its epoch-making merit was that it propounded the problem. This problem is one that no single individual will ever be able to solve. Although Hegel was, with Saint-Simon, the most encyclopedic mind of his time, yet he was limited first by the by the necessary limited extent of his own knowledge, and second, by the limited extent and depth of the knowledge and conceptions of his age. Again, real things in the universe have to evolve out of something in the universe, something that's already there. You can't evolve out of something that's not there. Is that making sense? That's just sort of how I want to say it. The conditions didn't allow Saint-Simon or Hegel to develop their thinking any further. And so, as you read this here, like, Engels isn't shitting on these guys. He is saying, here's where they went wrong, but he's saying, well, without these guys, we wouldn't have gotten here. And I hate to say that it's guys, but that is the case. It was just pretty chauvinist, male-dominated. We could talk about that another time. That's a whole thing. But reading it. So we're talking about the limits of knowledge. And he says, to these limits, a third must be added. Hegel was an idealist. To him, the thoughts within his brain were not the more or less abstract pictures of actual things and processes, but conversely, things and their evolution were only the realized picture of the idea existing somewhere from eternity before the world was. This way of thinking turned everything upside down and completely reversed the actual connection of things in the world. So, if you'll allow me, correctly and ingeniously as many groups of facts were grasped by Hegel, yet for the reasons just given, there is much that is botched, artificial, labored, in a word, wrong in point of detail. The Hegelian system, in itself, was a colossal miscarriage, but it was also the last of its kind. It was suffering, in fact, from an internal and incurable contradiction. Upon the one hand, its essential proposition was the conception that human process is a his, is a I'm sorry, that human history is a process of evolution. Let me read that again. I got lost. Its essential proposition was the conception that human history is a process of evolution, which, by its very nature, cannot find its intellectual final term in the discovery of any so-called absolute truth. But on the other hand, it laid claim to being the very essence of this absolute truth. A system of natural and historical knowledge, embracing everything and final for all time, is a contradiction to the fundamental law of dialectic reasoning. This law, indeed, by no means excludes, but on the contrary includes the idea that the systematic knowledge of the external universe can make giant strides from age to age. The perception of the fundamental contradiction in German idealism led necessarily back to materialism. But nota bene, or take special notice, not to the simply metaphysical, exclusively mechanical materialism of the 18th century. Old materialism looked upon all previous history as a crude heap of irrationality and violence. Modern materialism sees in it the process of evolution of humanity and aims at discovering the laws thereof. With the French of the 18th century, and even with Hegel, bear with me, I just closed my notes. Again, I got lost. Again, with the French of the 18th century, and even with Hegel, oops, no, he's still upside down, that's okay. The conception obtained of nature as a whole, moving in narrow circles and forever immutable, with its eternal celestial bodies, as Newton, an unalterable organic species, as Linnaeus taught. Modern materialism embraces the more recent discoveries of natural science, according to which nature also has its history in time. The celestial bodies, like the organic species that, under favorable conditions, people them, being born and perishing. And even if nature as a whole must still be said to move in recurrent circles, these cycles assume infinitely larger dimensions. In both aspects, modern materialism is essentially dialectic, and no longer requires the assistance of that sort of philosophy which, queen-like, pretended to rule the remaining mob of sciences. As soon as each special science is bound to make clear its position in the great totality of things and our knowledge of things, a special science dealing with this totality is superfluous or unnecessary. That which still survives all of earlier philosophy is the science of thought and its law, formal logic, and dialectics. Everything else is subsumed in the positive science of nature and history. Whilst, however, the revolution in the conception of nature could be made in proportion to the corresponding positive materials furnished by research, already much earlier certain historical facts had occurred which led to a decisive change in the conception of history. In 1831, the first working class rising took place in Lyons. Lyon? I don't know where that is. Between 1838 and 1842, the first national working class movement, that of the English Chartists, reached its height. The class struggle between the proletariat and bourgeoisie came to the front in the history of the most advanced countries in Europe, in proportion to the development, upon the one hand, of modern industry, upon the other, of the newly acquired political supremacy of the bourgeoisie. Facts more and more strenuously gave the lie to the teachings of bourgeois economy as to the identity of the interests of capital and labor, as to the universal harmony and universal prosperity that would be the consequence of unbridled competition. All these things could no longer be ignored, any more than the French and English socialism, which was their theoretical, though very imperfect, expression. But the old idealist conception of history, which was not yet dislodged, knew nothing of class struggles based upon economic interests. Knew nothing of economic interests. Production and all economic relations appeared in it only as incidental, subordinate elements in the history of civilization. The new facts made imperative a new examination of all past history. Then it was seen that all past history, with the exception of its primitive stages, was the history of class struggles. That these warring classes of society are always the products of the modes of production and of exchange. In a word, of the economic conditions of their time. That the economic structure of society always furnishes the real basis starting from which we can alone work out the ultimate explanation of the whole superstructure of juridical and political institutions, as well as of the religious, philosophical, and other ideas of a given historical period. Hegel has freed history from metaphysics, but he made it a dialectic. But he made it dialectic, but his conception of history was essentially idealistic. But now, an idealism was driven from its last refuge, the philosophy of history. Now, a materialistic treatment of history was propounded, and a method found of explaining man's knowing by his being, instead of as heretofore his being by his knowing. Is it a I think therefore I am kind of thing? He's saying German idealism brought these questions to the forefront, and to them we give thanks. Without them, we sort of couldn't have evolved on that question. Which, sure, yeah, they ended up on the wrong end of they got the wrong answer, but, thanks for asking the question. So Engels says here, from that time forward, socialism was no longer an accidental discovery of this or that ingenious brain, but the necessary outcome of the struggle between the two historically developed classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Its task was no longer to manufacture a system of society as perfect as possible, but to examine the historical economic succession of events from which these classes and their antagonism had of necessity sprung, and to discover in the economic conditions thus created the means of ending the conflict. That is scientific socialism as opposed to utopian. Engels says, but the socialism of earlier days was incompatible with this materialist conception, as the conception of nature of the French materialists was with dialectics and modern natural science. The socialism of earlier days certainly criticized the existing capitalist mode of production and its consequences, but it could not explain them, and therefore could not get the mastery of them. It could only reject them as bad. The more strongly this earlier socialism denounced the exploitations of the working class inevitable under capitalism, the less able was it clearly to show in what this exploitation consisted and how it arose. But for this, it was necessary to present the capitalist mode of production in its historical connection and its inevitableness during a particular historical epoch, and therefore also to present its inevitable downfall, and to lay bare its essential character, which was still a secret. This was done by the discovery of surplus value. It's like this secret that was hiding in plain sight. And Marx goes, "Oh, what? There it is." And no one saw it. Engels says it was shown that the appropriation of unpaid labor is the basis of the capitalist mode of production and of the exploitation of the worker that occurs under it. That even if the capitalist buys the labor power of his laborer at its full value as a commodity on the market, he yet extracts more value from it than he paid for, and that in the ultimate analysis, this surplus value forms those sums of value from which are heaped upon constantly increasing masses of capital in the hands of the possessing classes. There it is, the germ of capitalism and its inevitable driving us into separate classes. He explains it in like, it just really quickly, it's insane. He says the genesis of capitalist production and the production of capital were both explained. These two great discoveries, the materialistic conception of history and the revelation of the secret capitalist production through surplus value, we owe to Marx. With these discoveries, socialism became a science. The next thing was to work out all its details and relations. I'm telling you, that chapter hits. That is a banger. Wow. So good. I don't even know if I could pick a favorite part, you know? He's taken capital, you guys. He's taken capital and he's just distilling it. You know how you take fermented juice and you distill it and it turns into a spirit? This is what it is. This is the spirit of Marx, distilled for you. This is sort of the dummies version of Marx, to be honest, which is why I like it, because I'm a dummy. Well, I hope you like reading this with me. I hope you got something out of it. If you think this is valuable at all, remember that it's really helpful to support this kind of media, to help keep independent communist media alive. And every little bit helps. Live viewers, stick around. Replay viewers, make sure you check out the next chapter, Chapter 3, Historical Materialism. That's when you take dialectical materialism, a worldview of it's just the way you see reality, and then you apply it to human society and of its development. I can't wait to check out Chapter 3 with you, Historical Materialism. Love your face.